They called her wild meat in front of the men. So I covered her and faced them alone. The dust hung thick in the air. That September afternoon when I first saw her stumble into Deadwood Gulch, she was barely more than skin and bones, her calico dress torn and faded, feet wrapped in strips of hide that had once been shoes. But it wasn't her sorry state that caught my attention. It was the way she held her head high despite everything, chin raised like she was facing down the devil himself. My name's Samuel Morrison, and I'd seen enough broken souls drift through mining towns to know the difference between someone who'd given up and someone who was still fighting. This girl couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. She was still fighting. I was sitting on the porch of McCarty's General Store whittling a piece of pine and watching the afternoon traffic when she appeared. The September sun was beginning its descent behind the Black Hills, painting long shadows across the rutted Main Street. Miners were heading back from their claims, covered in dust and disappointment. Most of the gold had played out years ago, but hope dies hard in men's hearts. She stopped in front of the store, swaying slightly on her feet. I could see her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress, and her eyes held that hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe weeks. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying a surprising strength despite her condition. "Might there be work in this town for someone willing to do honest labor?" I set down my whittling knife and studied her face. High cheekbones, intelligent green eyes, and a mouth that looked like it was more accustomed to smiling than the grim line it held now. There was breeding there, education. This wasn't some frontier girl born to hardship. "Depends on what kind of honest labor you're talking about, miss," I replied carefully. "Not much call for fancy skills in Deadwood Gulch." She straightened her shoulders. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend the sick. I worked as a governess back in St. Louis before." She trailed off and I didn't press. Everyone who ended up in places like Deadwood Gulch had a before. Usually it wasn't something they cared to discuss. "Well now," I said, standing up and dusting wood shavings from my pants, "Mrs. Chen, who runs the boarding house, could use some help. Food's not much to speak of, but it's regular and she's got a spare room in the back." The relief that flooded her face was like watching sunrise break over the mountains. "Thank you, sir. Truly. Sam Morrison," I said, extending my hand. Sarah Williams," she replied, taking my hand briefly. I noticed she hesitated over the surname and filed that information away. I walked her over to Chen's boarding house, a 2-story clapboard building that had seen better days but was clean and honest. Mrs. Chen, a stout Chinese woman whose husband had come to work the railroad and stayed to run a business, looked Sarah up and down with shrewd eyes. "You sick?" Miss Chen asked bluntly. "No ma'am, just hungry." "You steal?" "No ma'am." "You drink?" "No ma'am." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Good. You clean rooms, help with cooking, wash linens, room and board, $2 a week. You want job?" "Yes ma'am. Very much." And that's how Sarah Williams came to Deadwood Gulch. For 3 weeks she worked quietly and efficiently, keeping to herself mostly. She had a way with the sick miners who occasionally needed tending, and her cooking was a damn sight better than anything Mrs. Chen had managed before. The woman had clearly received a proper education. I caught her reading a book of poetry by lamplight one evening when I passed by the boarding house. She never spoke of her past, and I respected that. In mining towns, a person's history was their own business, unless they chose to share it. But trouble has a way of finding people, especially women alone on the frontier. It found Sarah Williams on a Friday night when the Brennan brothers rode into town. The Brennans, Jake, Cole and Tommy, were the kind of men who gave the frontier a bad name. They ran cattle when it suited them, rustled when it didn't, and generally made nuisances of themselves wherever they went. They weren't wanted by the law exactly, but they weren't welcome in most decent towns either. I was having a drink at Murphy's saloon when they pushed through the batwing doors, spurs jangling and smelling of sweat and horse. Jake Brennan was the oldest and meanest, a thick-set man with small dark eyes and hands like ham hocks. Cole was the prettiest of the three, which wasn't saying much, and Tommy was just plain mean through and through. "Whiskey," Jake demanded, slapping a silver dollar on the bar. "And information." Murphy, the bartender, poured 3 glasses and slid them across the scarred wooden surface. "What kind of information?" "Looking for a woman," Cole said, tossing back his drink. About 20 years old, brown hair, green eyes. Might be calling herself Williams or maybe Johnson. She's got a particular mark on her left shoulder, scar shaped like a crescent moon. My blood went cold. I'd glimpsed that exact scar when Sarah was hanging laundry and her sleeve had slipped. I kept my face carefully neutral and took another sip of my beer. Don't recall seeing anyone like that, Murphy lied smoothly. He was a good man, Murphy. Minded his own business and expected others to do the same. Jake Brennan's eyes narrowed. You sure about that? There's a $50 reward for information leading to her whereabouts. $50 was more money than most folks in Deadwood Gulch saw in 3 months. I saw Murphy's hand pause slightly as he wiped down a glass, but to his credit he didn't change his answer. Like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description. The Brennans finished their drinks and left, but I knew they weren't giving up. Men don't put $50 bounties on people unless they want them very badly indeed. I waited until they'd ridden out of town before making my way to the boarding house. Sarah was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Chen prepare the evening meal. When she saw my face, she went pale. They're looking for you, I said without preamble. The Brennan brothers. $50 reward. Sarah's hands stilled on the pot she'd been stirring. Mrs. Chen looked between us, then quietly left the kitchen, understanding that this was not her business. How long do I have? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. They rode out, but they'll be back. They'll ask questions, search the buildings. Sarah, or whatever your real name is, you need to tell me what this is about. I can't help you if I don't know what I'm dealing with. She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell. My father owns a plantation outside New Orleans, or owned rather. The war ruined him financially, but he managed to hold on to the land and some of his connections. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. When I turned 18, he arranged a marriage for me to Jake Brennan. It would have settled his debts and given the Brennans the respectability they craved. I tried to refuse, but my father, he has ways of ensuring compliance. The scar on her shoulder suddenly made sense. I felt anger building in my chest like steam in a boiler. So you ran. 3 months ago. I made it to St. Louis, then west. I thought I'd lost them. She looked up at me with those green eyes full of pain and determination. I won't go back, Mr. Morrison. I'd rather die first. That might not be a choice they give you, I said grimly. The Brennans aren't known for their gentle treatment of women. Then what do you suggest? I studied her face, seeing the steel beneath the fear. This woman had already shown remarkable courage just by running. She deserved a chance at freedom. I suggest we even the odds. The next morning I paid a visit to Dr. Holcomb, one of the few educated men in Deadwood Gulch. He'd been a surgeon during the war and had steady hands and a good heart. I found him in his office, reading a medical journal by the window. Doc, I need a favor. He looked up over his spectacle. What kind of favor, Sam? The kind where you forget you saw someone if certain folks come asking. Dr. Holcomb set down his journal and leaned back in his chair. This about that young woman working at Chen's place. Might be. She in trouble. The kind of trouble that follows women who refuse to marry men like Jake Brennan. The doctor's face hardened. He'd seen enough of what men could do to women during the war. What do you need? Sarah Williams died of fever last night. You treated her, but couldn't save. Body was burned to prevent the spread of disease. Mrs. Chen can verify she was sick. And where did Miss Williams go? That's not for you to know, Doc. Just in case. He nodded slowly. Fever's a terrible thing. Took a young woman just last night, matter of fact. Appreciate it, Doc. That afternoon I made the rounds to the other decent folks in town, Murphy, Mrs. Chen, the blacksmith Tom Bradley, and a few others. I didn't tell them the whole story, just that a good woman needed help staying hidden from bad men. In places like Deadwood Gulch, that was enough. People who'd come west to escape their own troubles understood the value of discretion. The Brennans returned Tuesday evening just as I'd expected. This time they brought 2 more men with them, hired guns by the look of them, all cold eyes and tied down holster. I was back at Murphy's when they pushed through the doors, making more noise than necessary. The other patrons suddenly found their drinks very interesting. We heard there was a woman died here recently, Cole Brennan said to Murphy. Fever, was it? That's right, Murphy replied evenly. Terrible thing. Doc tried to save her, but the fever took her quick. Jake Brennan's eyes swept the room, landing on me. You know anything about this woman, stranger? I looked up from my beer, making my voice casual. Saw her around town, worked at the boarding house. Pretty little thing, shame about the fever. What'd she look like? Brown hair, green eyes, skinny as a rail. Why, you know her. The Brennans exchanged glances. Might have. Where's the body? Burned, I said, taking another sip. Doc's orders. Didn't want the fever spreading. Jake Brennan's face was turning red. That's mighty convenient. I set down my beer carefully and turned to face him fully. You calling me a liar, friend? The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Every man present knew that calling someone a liar in a frontier saloon was the same as calling them out. The hired gun's hands drifted closer to their weapons. Just seems awful convenient, Jake repeated, but his tone was more cautious now. Fever don't care about convenience. Ask the doc if you don't believe me. Ask Mrs. Chen. Ask anyone who was here. For a moment it looked like Jake might push the issue, but Dr. Holcomb chose that moment to walk into the saloon, nodding to me as he ordered a whiskey. Evening, Doc, I said loudly. Shame about that girl who died of fever. You did everything you could. Dr. Holcomb sighed heavily. Indeed, tragic case. The fever took her so quickly there was nothing to be done. Had to burn the body immediately to prevent contagion. Jake Brennan stared at the doctor for a long moment, then turned back to me. What'd you say your name was? Sam Morrison. You seem mighty interested in our business, Morrison. I stood up slowly, my hand resting casually near my gun belt. I'm interested in men who ride into town asking questions about dead women. Makes a fellow wonder what kind of business you were in with her. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. The hired guns shifted nervously, and I could see Cole Brennan calculating odds. 5 against 1 weren't terrible odds if you were fast enough and had the element of surprise. But Jake Brennan was smarter than he looked. He wasn't sure about the woman being dead, but he also wasn't sure she was. And starting a gunfight in a room full of potential witnesses over uncertainty wasn't good business. Come on, he said finally to his men. Nothing for us here. They filed out, spurs jangling, but I knew they weren't finished. Men like the Brennans didn't give up easy, especially when money was involved. I waited until I was sure they'd left town before making my way to the old mine shaft about 2 miles northeast of Deadwood Gulch. It had been abandoned for 3 years after a cave-in, but the first chamber was still sound. I'd stocked it with supplies, food, water, blankets, and most importantly a horse. Sarah was waiting there, dressed in men's clothing I'd procured for her. She'd cut her hair short and looked like a young cowboy from a distance. They bought it? She asked. For now, but they'll be back, and next time they might not be so easily convinced. She nodded, understanding. Then it's time for me to move on. I've been thinking about that, I said. You could go north to Dakota Territory, or west to Oregon. Both are far enough away and growing fast enough that a person could disappear. What about you? Won't they suspect you helped me? I shrugged. Let them suspect. Suspecting and proving are different things. She stepped closer and I could see tears in her eyes. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. I thought about that for a moment. I knew a girl once, back in Kansas. Sweet thing named Mary. Her father tried to marry her off to a man who beat his horses and his dog. She ran away too, but she didn't make it. They found her body in the river 3 days later. Sarah's hand touched my arm gently. I'm sorry. Point is, sometimes a man gets a chance to do right by someone when he couldn't before. I figure this is my chance. We heard riders approaching and both tensed, but it was only Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, leading a second horse. Thought you might could use another mount, he said simply, handing Sarah the reins. This one's got good wind and won't shy from gunfire. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Tom nodded and rode back toward town without another word. That was the way of it in places like Deadwood Gulch. Good people helped when they could and didn't expect speeches about it. I should go, Sarah said, swinging up into the saddle with practiced ease. Even in men's clothes she sat a horse like a lady. Head north toward Rapid City, then west, I advised. Stay off the main trails and don't stop in any town long enough for people to remember you. She gathered the reins, then looked down at me. What if they come back? What if they don't believe the story? Then I'll handle it. 5 men, Sam. Professional gunfighters. I smiled grimly. I wasn't always a shopkeeper, Sarah. I can handle myself. She leaned down from the saddle and kissed my cheek quickly. Thank you, Sam Morrison, for everything. Then she was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk like she'd never been there at all. I made my way back to town, stopping at Murphy's for one more drink before bed. The saloon was quiet, just a few regulars playing cards by lamplight. I was halfway through my beer when the batwing doors exploded inward. The Brennans were back and they looked angry. "Morrison," Jake Brennan bellowed, "we want to talk to you." The card players scattered like quail, leaving just me, Murphy, and 5 armed men who clearly weren't in a talking mood. "I'm listening," I said, not turning around. "We went back to that mine where you told us the girl died," Cole Brennan said. "Funny thing, we found horse tracks. Fresh ones." I took another sip of beer. "Lots of horses around here. Not shod like those were. Those were town shoes, not range shoes." I finally turned to face them, noting how they'd spread out to give themselves clear lines of fire. Professional indeed. "What's your point?" "My point," Jake Brennan snarled, "is that I think you're a lying son of a bitch. I think that girl is alive, and I think you helped her run. Think what you like. Where is she?" "In the ground, far as I know." Jake's hand dropped to his gun butt. "Last chance, Morrison. Where is she?" I set my beer down carefully and turned to face them fully. The smart play would have been to tell them which direction Sarah had gone, and hope they never caught up to her. But sometimes smart isn't the same as right. "I told you already. She died of fever. Doc burned the body." "You're lying." The first gun cleared leather before I'd finished speaking, but I'd been expecting it. My Colt .45 seemed to jump into my hand of its own accord, spitting fire and thunder in the confined space of the saloon. Jake Brennan went down first, my bullet taking him center mass. One of the hired guns got off a shot that splintered the bar next to my head before my second bullet dropped him. Cole Brennan's shot went wide as he dove for cover behind an overturned table. Murphy had disappeared behind the bar, sensibly getting out of the line of fire. The remaining gunman was trying to get a clean shot when Tommy Brennan's rifle cracked from the doorway. I felt the bullet burn across my ribs but managed to put 2 quick shots into the hired gun before spinning toward Tommy. His second shot shattered a bottle behind the bar as my bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Cole Brennan popped up from behind his table, pistol aimed at my chest. For a moment we stared at each other across the smoke-filled room, both knowing that whoever fired first would likely be the only one walking away. "She's gone," I said quietly. "Even if you kill me, you'll never find her." His face twisted with rage. "My father will hang for this if we don't bring her back. Do you understand that? The money he borrowed, the promises he made, that's not her problem. It is now." His finger tightened on the trigger, and I prepared to take my final shot when Doc Holcomb's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, son." Cole's eyes flicked toward the doctor, who stood in the doorway with a double-barreled shotgun pointed at his back. This man was defending a woman's honor. Dr. Holcomb said calmly, "In my book that makes him the hero of this piece." Behind the doctor I could see Tom Bradley and 3 other townsmen, all armed. Cole Brennan looked around the room, taking in his dead brother, his wounded cousin, and the very unfriendly faces surrounding him. "This isn't over," he said finally, lowering his gun. "Yes," I replied, "it is." Cole helped Tommy to his feet, and they stumbled out of the saloon, leaving their dead behind. I knew they wouldn't be back. Men like the Brennans only fought when they had the advantage, and they'd lost that along with Jake. Dr. Holcomb examined my ribs while Murphy swept up broken glass and the other men dealt with the bodies. The bullet had just creased me, nothing serious. "Think they'll give up?" the doctor asked as he bandaged my side. "They don't have much choice." Jake was the driving force behind the whole thing. Without him, Cole doesn't have the stomach for a real fight. And I was right. The Brennans never returned to Deadwood Gulch. Word came later that they'd sold their cattle and headed back east, probably to face whatever trouble awaited them there. As for Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, I never saw her again, but 3 years later I received a letter postmarked from Oregon Territory. Inside was a pressed wildflower and a photograph of a woman in a white dress, standing next to a man in a suit, both of them smiling. On the back in careful script were the words, "Thank you for giving me the chance to choose my own life. S. Morrison." She'd taken my name. I reckon that was about the finest compliment anyone ever paid me. I kept that photograph on my mantelpiece for the rest of my life, a reminder that sometimes doing right costs more than you plan to pay, but it's worth every penny. In a world where women had precious few choices and fewer champions, standing up for one woman's right to choose her own fate seemed like the least a decent man could do. They'd called her wild meat in front of those men, reducing her to something less than human. But I'd seen the strength in her eyes, the dignity in her bearing, and the courage it took to choose freedom over security. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell was nobody's property, and I was proud to have helped her prove it. That's the way I remember it anyway. And in Deadwood Gulch,
A man's word and his willingness to back it up were about the only things that truly mattered.